The Switch 2 is Nintendo's most powerful console of all time, but if every game is still locked to 60 FPS or even 30, what is all this power really for? To find out what it's truly capable of, I got my hands on the real GPU that's inside this handheld, or at least the closest thing you can actually buy. And in this video, we're going to find out what the Nintendo Switch 2's GPU can really do, because inside of this machine isn't just some regular graphics card. It's a custom NVIDIA Tegra T239, an SoC designed specifically for Nintendo, which if you didn't know is basically just a CPU and GPU combined onto one chip. But don't let its small size fool you. It's built on the same Ampere architecture that powers the RTX 30 series, some of the most popular GPUs in the world. But instead of pulling hundreds of watts of power, the Switch 2 pulls less than 20 watts in total, making it one of the most efficient gaming devices ever made. And just like any other 30 series graphics card, it supports both DLSS upscaling and ray tracing, key features we will be testing in just a second. But here's where things get really weird. Although it shares everything in common with the 30 series GPUs, the closest PC equivalent to the Switch 2's GPU is actually the RTX 2050. Yeah, the 2050. It might sound completely outdated, and honestly, I thought the same. But it actually has the same GPU die as the RTX 3050 Mobile, has the same 30 series features, and was released about half a year later. I think the 2050 should be called the 3040 instead, but it doesn't really matter. What does matter though is that according to Digital Foundry and GeekerOne's videos, if you downclock a 2050 to match the Switch 2, its performance is pretty much the same as the real deal. And that's where things get interesting, because recent articles are saying that the Switch 2's optimization is so good it performs just under an Xbox Series S. And thanks to DLSS, Cyberpunk's co-developers claim that any Xbox Series S game running at 60 FPS can be easily ported to the Switch 2. I'm not one to believe everything I read, but after seeing real gameplay footage of Cyberpunk running on this tiny handheld, I wouldn't be surprised if they're being 100% honest. So now that we know the GPU in this console is essentially an ultra-efficient cut-down version of the RTX 2050, it's time to answer the obvious question. What if Nintendo never had to cut it down? Turns out that was a fucking expensive question to answer, because a desktop version of the 2050 doesn't exist. I had to buy an entirely new laptop just for this video. Not ideal and definitely not cheap. It cost me as much as the console itself. With the same amount of total memory and specs as close to the Switch 2 as reasonably possible, this laptop is more or less the closest PC equivalent I could find. But instead of redoing what everyone else already did for the third time, let's get right to answering the question I asked at the start of the video, to see what the Switch 2's GPU can really do when it isn't being throttled by a 20-watt power limit. Starting with some of the easier games to run before pushing this thing to its absolute limits in Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing. With Rocket League being one of the easiest competitive games to run, it isn't surprising that the 2050 runs it at max settings over 200 FPS consistently. But weirdly, if you play this game on the actual Switch 2, it only runs 720p 60 FPS, as it's still using the Switch 1 build. That is ridiculous considering the new hardware is 10 times more powerful. So why is Epic Games still holding back on updating one of their most popular games? Hopefully they drop an update soon, because the T239 in the Switch 2 is absolutely capable of smooth 1080p 120 FPS gameplay. And just before we get to the AAA games, let's try out Fortnite. It's not usually considered a demanding game, but once you enable ray tracing, it becomes one of the hardest titles to run properly. But let's start with performance mode. Although running the game on performance mode makes it a lot more CPU intensive, it's important to show you the results in performance mode anyways, as these are the preferred competitive settings for the vast majority of players. To benchmark Fortnite, I ran a replay of a ranked match I played live on Twitch. I'm streaming 3+ times a week on there, and I'm streaming right now. We're hitting nasty clips for these videos over on Twitch, so be sure to drop a follow. You do not want to miss the streams. But yeah, pretty decent results, and would probably be even better if the laptop came with a better CPU. And with medium settings similar to how the Switch 2 runs Fortnite, we're getting 85 average FPS, which is totally playable. I don't see why they couldn't just give us an option to increase the frame limit from 60, because even a 70 FPS cap would make a noticeable difference. But honestly, I'm just glad it's not the same stuttery 30 FPS on the original Switch. Like, look at these Roblox ass trees, like Next, I wanted to test a couple older AAA titles that don't use ray tracing but still look great in 2025, before jumping into the most demanding games. Tomb Raider on the Ultimate preset gets a 90 FPS average without any issues, which makes me wonder why the Tomb Raider Survivor Trilogy still isn't on the Switch 2. On the other hand, things don't look nearly as smooth in the 2015 sequel to this game. I thought the 2050 would crush a game released 6 years before it, but something weird happened. Rise of the Tomb Raider on the very high preset looked great at first, until we stopped looking into the sky. The very high textures completely fill the 4GB VRAM buffer, leading to major frame time spikes and unstable 1% lows. Dropping textures down to high and enabling DLSS balanced, however, brought things up to 87 FPS with much more stable frame times. But while those games give us a solid sense of how this GPU handles lighter and older titles, what happens when we turn RTX on and push it to its limits? This is where it starts getting complicated. Starting with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. On the highest preset with DLSS on, it crashed midway through the benchmark, which is crazy because I didn't even get to turn on ray tracing yet. Luckily, as long as you turn down textures from ultra to high, it runs smooth as concrete. So I ended up changing it to the high preset and it worked out pretty well, getting an average of 73 FPS. However, I wanted to elevate the RT features as this is an RTX card, so I tried high settings with medium RT and got a solid 66 average FPS. And in-game, it's definitely playable like this. But don't get your hopes up just yet, because Shadow of the Tomb Raider only has ray trace shadows. We've barely scratched the surface of what makes modern ray tracing so hard to run. For a proper RT stress test, we need something way heavier. Something like Control. Knowing that a game like Cyberpunk is playable on the Switch 2, I went into this game with pretty high expectations. But after finding out that you can only play this game on the Switch 2 using cloud gaming, I was intrigued to see how it would run if it ran natively. On high settings using DLSS performance with both texture settings turned down to their lowest, the game runs consistently above 60 FPS. When you add on the high ray tracing preset, which adds ray trace reflections, lighting, shadows, and everything, it somehow holds up a lot better than I thought it would. Just make sure you're prepared for these huge stutters, especially when you enter a new area of the map. Nevertheless, that brings us to the ultimate GPU benchmark, Cyberpunk 2077. At medium settings with DLSS balanced, it managed 56 FPS with no spikes, which honestly isn't bad for an entry-level card. But it isn't a true Cyberpunk benchmark without testing ray tracing, so I enabled RT contact shadows and switched DLSS to performance. That brought me down to about 53 FPS, so it can ray trace, just not very well. So after all that testing, what can the Switch 2's GPU really do? Well, when it's not being throttled by a 20-watt limit, it's actually pretty solid. And as more developers take advantage of the hardware, the console could end up being an even better purchase over time. But this also shows just how much untapped potential is sitting inside the Switch 2, because what it can do with less than 20 watts is unbelievable. If it had a bigger battery and the same power budget as this 2050 laptop, who knows how insanely powerful it could have been. Nintendo might have nerfed their own chip on purpose, but with plenty of software updates on the way, it has the potential to be the best gaming handheld you can buy right now. And if you enjoyed this video, you're probably gonna like this one too, so watch this video next.